Hello, fictional. Welcome to the Fiction Series X. Today we are gonna see, what if Issei got harem with Rias and Akeno? Part 11. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. The situation was untenable, Sona firmly decided. The day before, this morning, everything had been going so well. And now, this. She didn't know who was messing with their lives in such a manner, but she knew whatever happened next would haunt more than just her. After Issei had collapsed, the females of the orc had rushed him, spiriting him away through a hastily crafted circle, leaving the space behind the old school building quiet. After a few moments, she had gathered her own peerage together, Saji supporting and restraining an irate Kiba, who had yet to stop glaring hatefully at the three exorcists. Said women had retrieved their white robes and were gathered closely. Zenobia looked as if she'd rather be anywhere but near her guardian, who had fixed her attention on a nervously sweating Arena. The girl didn't look apologetic for stabbing the pawn, but certainly did seem apprehensive for the unadulterated anger Griselda was directing at her. Against her misgivings, Sona ordered her servants to kindly escort the exorcists with them through a transport glyph of her own making. In times of emergencies, she and Rias had agreed to let each other into the other's stronghold off campus. Tsubasa, Tsubaki, and Momo complied, though each was careful to keep a healthy distance between them, the exorcists and Saji, who was especially vulnerable to both kinds of holy sword, thanks to his dragon-type sacred gear. After transiting through the pale array, she instructed the majority of her peerage to stay behind in the apartment's main living room, while she, Tsubaki, Tsubasa, Saji, Kiba, and the church trio the hallway to the master bedroom, where she sensed high-level magic being cast. For a moment, Sona paused to reconsider the wisdom of bringing the church representatives here, especially with Rias in such a frantic state. Regardless of how the school was run, Rias was the appointed owner of the Kuo territory, and therefore it was up to her to allow the exorcists free run of the place or not. Bringing them here could spell disaster for the current ceasefire. She internally sighed. Really, there wasn't much choice. By the rules laid down for their continued stay in the human world, Rias had to make a call and soon. She opened the door to the master bedroom and promptly paused in the doorway. Mentally reciting an otherwise useless spell, she summoned a minute amount of her power. A magic circle appeared at eye level with Saji that promptly altered his pupils into perfectly reflective mirrors, blinding him. Satisfied that her pawn wouldn't react poorly in front of the newcomers, she ushered the rest inside. Several bodies lay piled upon the large bed. Issei's upper body had been summarily stripped, leaving him only in the bloodied cargo wear he favored. Rias and Akeno had stripped entirely and were currently reclined against the headboard, pressed against his broad back and cradling his head to their bosoms, already engaged in the skinship healing of their kind. She repressed a surge of physical excitement at seeing Issei shirtless. This was the second time and it was just as enticing as the first. No, bad thoughts. Instead her focus shifted to the breasts he was cushioned upon and felt a hint of inadequacy. By Lucifer, it just wasn't fair that the Grimoire blood granted Rias exceedingly seductive features. Same to Akeno, her fallen heritage made her equally sensuous. She was exceedingly careful not to invoke her sister's name, who coincidentally had bigger breasts than her as well. But that was neither here nor there. The apparent reason Issei hadn't been completely divested of his attire was the presence of three other girls. Asia was kneeling beside Issei, her hands held above the wound, twilight healing aglow. To the side, Ravel was stacking what appeared to be phoenix tear vials, apparently all emptied in an attempt to keep him alive, even against his normal magical resistance. Hineko herself had latched onto Issei's leg on the opposite side from Asia. The Nekashu had her ears out and tail wrapped around his leg as well, glowing bluish-white with Kai as she bolstered the demidrake's life force. Without warning, Asia fell back, exhausted. The green glow of twilight healing disappeared. To her surprise, Sona saw that the physical wound had been mostly repaired, though an angry red scar remained. Now, it was up to the others to deal with the magical and non-physical effects of the blow. The group waited patiently for Rias, Akeno, and Kaneko to finish their work, if they even would. After nearly half an hour of silence, the glow around Kaneko ceased as she sleepily opened her eyes. Rias and Akeno struggled to stay awake, as well as they repositioned themselves into a more comfortable place, though Issei remained snuggled between them. Their sleepiness evaporated quickly when the older girls noticed the presence of the exorcists, particularly Arena. Sona, would you care to explain what they are doing here? Rias managed to keep her voice calm and composed, all things considered. But it was clear her civility would soon wear thin. You're still the highest authority of this territory, Rias. What to do with them is ultimately up to you. Then let me make this simple. Rias turned her cold gaze to the trio. I want them gone from Kuo immediately. Sona nodded, but was startled when the blue-haired girl, Zenobia, stepped forward in outrage. You can't just dismiss us like that. I certainly can. You're trespassing on my territory for a cause that has gravely injured one of my treasured household. If you wish to remain, then you'd better have a damn good reason beyond treasure hunting for your precious shards." Her grip on Issei tightened as she hugged his body closer. "You've done enough damage already." A hand clamped down on Zenovia's shoulder as Griselda spoke up. "Heiress Gremory, I must ask you to reconsider. Kakabiel is a known rogue and warmonger. Retrieving the shards is currently the only method known to us that can disrupt his plans to begin the Great War anew. If you think that pretty words and reason will sway me to forgive you, then you are mistaken. As it is, one of yours has yet to apologize for what she has done." Rias had been taking lessons apparently. While not a dragon, she growled her anger to the leader in a manner that would have made her bondmate proud. "What I did? That dragon was about to destroy Excalibur Mimic." Irina laid a hand defensively on the ribbon coiled around her arm. "He was very close too. Our orders were to retrieve the swords at all cost, orders from heaven. I had to. Speaking of what must be done, you are Asia Argento, are you not? The holy maiden who became a witch." Zenovia addressed Asia, a hand on her destruction. "I thought I recognized you." "Yes, I'm Asia," the gentle bishop stuttered, surprised and uncomfortable at the sudden attention. "So becoming a devil is the height of your sin. I suppose it is only right that I remove your existence from the world." Before she could take a step, several things happened. Several magic circles flared as every king and queen in the room prevented her from coming any closer to the blonde girl. Second, a wave of killing intent washed over everyone, and surprisingly, it wasn't from any of the devils. It was from Griselda, the look on her face daring Zenovia to continue her actions, if only to enact punishment for such a reckless course. Lastly, almost every conscious person in the room began to shout, calling out against the other faction, promising swift retaliation against yet-to-be committed crimes. This continued for only a few moments until the cacophony was broken as someone roared, "Enough." Silence permeated the room as everyone trembled under the weight of the word. Everyone looked to the source of the noise, the unconscious demidrake still supported by his would-be mates. On Issei's right forearm, a circular patch of skin shone blue, in the exact spot where a jewel that adorned his scale mail would be when deployed. The vanishing dragon had now joined the conversation. "This bickering annoys me," Albion growled as the light flickered. "Fighting over scraps and scrapes like hatchlings, the lot of you." "Lord Albion," Griselda bowed low, "I would say it is a pleasure to meet, though I doubt that you share such sentiment." "Indeed. Now tell me, Blue One," Zenovia was startled at being addressed, "do enlighten me, what do you think attacking one of my host's dearest companions will earn you?" Zenovia was at a loss for words as the elder dragon continued. "In absence of Issei's conscious presence, I believe it fair that I speak for him. Having spent a decade with him and his thoughts, I know him better than all of you. And if he were to see you raise your blade against any he cared for with intent to harm, you would not survive a minute more." The blue-haired girl paused, then lowered her sword after a moment's hesitance. "My apologies, Asia Argento." She bowed to the blonde girl. "I was out of line." Asia had enough sense to not forgive the exorcist immediately, since Albion was still on the literal warpath. "And you, Twin Tails." Irina jumped at the attention, but frowned at Albion's chosen name for her. "Are you unintelligent?" No. "Then you are a fool, willingly bringing that sword here, to this region." "The Kuo? Kuo is my home, what's wrong with?" "Wrong. Kuo is not your home, no longer." Albion's roar and the pressure emanating from Issei's limp body pushed Irina to her knees. "Lord Albion, please." Griselda was cut off by the irreproachably angry beast. "Do not ask me for leniency or mercy, exorcist. Not after she brought Ascalon here, to the ancient nesting grounds." Ancient nesting. Irina's face had lost all color as she stared at the demidrake in horror. Oh god. You are perhaps the first being in history to willingly enter our territory and willfully harm a hatchling with a sword created from the desecrated remains of one of our kind. In all honesty, I had believed no one would be stupid enough to even dream of such an act, yet here you are as its perpetrator. "But Kuo is under devil control," Irina begged. "It can't be. The land was never ceded to any other race or faction. The power of dragons inevitably calls and entices all beings. We allowed peaceful humans to build the town above our grounds, and the devils followed after the last dragon, Issei, was kidnapped." Albion's light blinked angrily. "Heiress Gremory may be the one for whom to attempt negotiations for your little ceasefire, but I am the ultimate authority here." Sona and Rias looked to each other in surprise. This was new to both of them, and as it was, neither could exactly refute or provide evidence to the contrary that they were not in fact true owners of the territory. This land, this place, it was to be a safe haven for dragons of all species to raise their young in peace without fear. Yet you, a joyful proud acolyte of the order that dares to hunt us, you have taken that comfort away. And so, we shall do the same. You do know of the incident in AD 79. The exorcists looked to each other in confusion. "What do you mean, Lord Albion?" Zenovia tentatively asked. How quickly mankind forgets. The Greek god Hephaestus, intrigued by the malleability of our scales, sought to kidnap a clutch of eggs, hatch and raise them on his own, to harvest the younglings' hides. That ended in spectacular failure when the parents tracked their missing offspring to his favorite refinery. So why direct us to that event? Griselda wondered aloud. So that you understand that the magnitude of the Vesuvius foundry's destruction may soon be repeated worldwide. Our kind did not take part in your great war. Though individuals took sides, the majority of us set ourselves apart and aside from your petty conflicts. No more, not if you violate what sanctuary we have left. Heaven is the weakest of the factions, is it not? Reliant on the steady worship of Christians across the world. Tell me, the heavenly dragon sneered, how would heaven fare when every church, shrine, temple, and holy ground on God's good earth was reduced to rubble at nearly the exact same time? Mankind would not see our true forms, merely observe the effects as nature and its elements raged against the Christian faith. There was absolute silence as emotions reigned freely. Shock that Albion would consider advocating such a drastic course of action. Disbelief that the dragons were capable of such retaliation. Terror, particularly from the church faction who were well aware that the church, and heaven by extension, did not have the numbers or strength to be unable to properly defend against what would be for perhaps the first time in history, a unified dragon horde. Please, you cannot. Griselda gasped. Such destruction would cause unparalleled panic, countless lives lost. The extinction of Christianity. You cannot. I can. Do not assume I am above proceeding as such. Consider me a monster if you will, but eradicating the church and terrorizing humanity away from such belief will do wonders to atone for mortally injuring a child of our race. Be thankful that the devil girls were able to stabilize Issei, else I would have already made preparations. If that changes for the worse, then be assured you and your faith will die with him. Now if you wish to convince me otherwise, would you like to know my demands? Since the exorcists were incapable of doing little more than nod weakly, Albion continued. First, you shall remove Kakabiel and his followers from this region, I don't care how, with or without the help of House Gremory or House Citri. If they choose to aid you, that is their decision. Second, should you survive, you will send notice to heaven that we dragons shall be claiming the Garden of Eden in compensation for our violated home, by force if need be. Third, Twin Tails will submit and freely accept any punishment deemed appropriate by Issei when he wakes. Lastly, the three of you shall include Udo Kiba in your search for these fragments. When all is said and done, you will give him as many fragments as he desires. That wasn't part of the deal, Zenobia protested weakly. We were to keep the Excaliburs by right of first blood. My host's injury is significantly more than first blood that was intent to harm, to kill. As for your accord, I never made such agreement, therefore I am altering your deal. Pray I do not alter it any further. To everyone's surprise, Albion then addressed the last dragon present. Vritra, wake up. Saji winced as his sacred gear flared to life, the ruby lizard eyes glowing slightly more than normal. Albino, is that you? Indeed, old friend. Now wake up completely, I need your help. You and the others always do. Go away, Albino, I'm going back to sleep. Albion. The heavenly dragon reminded the Dragon King. And sleep is not an option for you, a hatchling has been injured by a dragonslayer on one of our nesting sites. All trace of weariness vanished as the red orbs blazed. Who dares? The twin tails standing near your current possessor. I've already made it clear what will happen should the hatchling's condition take a turn for the worse, but I'll need you to send the message to your other soul fragments. Get the word out the best you can, the church is to be targeted on my say-so, or if the hatchling perishes. Done. Wait a moment, are you inside the hatchling, Albino? A fortuitous turn of events that the child is half human at his core and capable of inheriting my power. And my name's still Albion. Furious, the black prison dragon muttered to himself. A demidrake inheriting your power, I suppose we'll find answers if we have the opportunity to bepize the sacred gear system. Vritra, focus. I am focused, Albino. My host is weak, is there anything else for me to be? With that, the sacred gear dematerialized and the light on Issei's arm disappeared, signaling the end of the conversation. Silence reigned for a minute before Sona sighed, aggravated. Our decision, of course, until the dragon inside my servant became involved. She turned to Griselda, as far as working with you goes, I am willing to provide assistance, assuming the three of you can accept constant observation. That is more than agreeable, Griselda nodded solemnly. Rias frowned as she watched the proceedings from her place on the bed. Sona, you're willing to support them. I never said I like the concept, but the dragons are right in one regard. Kakabiel needs to be dealt with lest he starts a war. Failing that, the dragons start a massacre against Heaven's presence, and just how long will the current ceasefire last when one side is besieged by an independent overpowered force? I'm not pleased, but if it avoids an all-out war, then I'll work with them for now. Sona then left, pulling a still-blinded Saji with her. They were followed by the rest of her peerage, trusting that the exorcists weren't foolhardy enough to provoke any further confrontation. Rias sighed in frustration. "Alright, we'll help. However, I'm instituting my own rules in addition to the vanishing dragons. You'll stay here in the suite, using the guest rooms during the duration of your stay, and when you leave the premises for any reason, you'll be escorted by one of my own at all times." Zenobia and Irina looked as if they were about to protest until a steel trap clamped down on the shoulders and forced them into a perfect bow from the waist, as Griselda bowed as well. "Thank you for your generous hospitality," Griselda calmly, though shakily, thanked her before pulling the girls out with her. Then it was just the orc. Rias shook her head wearily before looking to her only knight. "And what to do with you? If you're asking for an apology, then I'm sorry to disappoint." "Oh no, I don't want an apology. I want to know what in hell possessed you, what drives you to sacrifice Issei's life for your vengeance." "I do not deny it." Ria's tone was the coldest any of her servants had ever heard, even when dealing with Razor she wasn't nearly so frigid. "Tell me, what would your friends in the project think? Would they be proud that you're spending the lives of others to fulfill your misguided feelings of justice? Don't go. It seems to me," she continued, "that if they gave their lives for you to escape, then it would be to live for their sake, not sacrifice other in their name. Issei didn't need to. Issei made a choice to help you, yes, but of his own volition. You seem to have forgotten one of my lessons, Yudo." Her voice warmed, even for a moment. "When it comes to family, one doesn't need to ask for help." This was the final blow needed as Kiba clearly ran out of strength or inclination to continue the fight. Head bowed, he retreated through the door, whispering apologies to the others in his way. Asia looked worriedly at the knight as she poked her head into the hallway. Pulling back into the room, the gentle bishop asked, "Is he going to be alright?" "If you're referring to Kiba, then he'll need time before he comes to us," Ria sighed. "I'm not proud of what I told him, but it needed to be said. Now, if you're asking about Issei, that's a trickier question. Ascalon was forged specifically to drain dragons of their aura. Their soul, life force, physical power. Even though he's stable for now, there's no telling when he'll wake," Akeno picked up for her sister King. "And even then, it will take time for him to regain his strength." She gently caressed Issei's cheek, who even while unconscious lightly moved to nuzzle into her touch. Ravel and Kaneko looked to each other in relief, both putting aside their usual rivalry and happiness that their shared teacher would be alright. Not that he had been teaching much lately. Issei had only learned the bare minimum necessary for meditation to bastardize Senjutsu for his escape act. Most of what he now taught Kaneko was progressively reverse-engineered from his natural aura techniques and her own skill. Ravel's learning curve had leveled off as well. Once she had, begrudgingly, joined in the meditations with Kaneko, she had begun to more effectively channel her power as she slowly gained better control of her emotional state. Similarly, her use of Phoenix Fire was mostly inspired by the ways Issei used his own power. True, she didn't have anywhere the energy or reserves to perfectly or repeatedly emulate his skill, but she was making exceptional progress in self-study. Now, even though most progress was made on their own, neither first year ever considered lessons without Issei. Having him around, no, being near him, did wonders for them both. The feeling was shared by another competitor for his affection. Asia. Now, while the gentle girl did not have the same teacher-student relationship or even the upper-lower year difference, she made strides on her own. Without the reason to have Issei as a teacher, Asia instead had a much greater emotional bond with the demidrake. Stemming from the day the two first met, the care and affection he gave to Asia was seconded only by the relationships he had with Rias and Akeno. Perhaps that was to be expected, he was her first friend and had spent much more time with him than either first year. That was the unbiased truth, that their senpai was fighting for his affection just as much as they were. The unbiased truth was that it made the competition that much harder. Still, both girls didn't say anything when Asia sat down on the bed, as close to Issei as possible. Asia gently put a hand on the dragon's side and sighed in depression. Picking up on her mood, Akeno gently maneuvers Issei to rest wholly on Rias and stood. "Come on, Asia. We really should entertain our guests." For a moment, it looked as if the queen was going to redress in her uniform. Everyone was surprised when she instead acquired only her black thong before picking up Issei's button down. The fabric strained around her breasts, molding to her seductive figure, held closed over her front by the only button straining below her breasts, leaving all others undone to expose pale skin. "Akeno, really? Must you?" Rias asked with a note of dry humor. "This is our home after all," the Nadeshiko beauty finished tying up her hair. "As guests, the trio will simply have to bear it. Besides, I'd go out completely naked if I wasn't unsure if Saji has left yet." Thus decidedly undressed, Akeno kissed Issei chastely. "Pleasant dreams, my love," she whispered before calmly walking out. Asia followed, though she looked back at the still prone demidrake. Ravel followed a minute after upon trying and failing to find a proper reason or excuse for her to still be there in what she understood was Ria's time with her pawn. For a minute longer, Kaneko considered rejoining the duo on the bed in the guise of additionally strengthening Issei's life force, but she too picked up on the mood and left as well, ears down solemnly and her tail flicking idly. Once everyone had gone, Rias gently lowered Issei so that the was fully laid back and adjusted her own position to fully utilize his responsibilities as her personal hug pillow. Pulling one off his arms around her, she settled down, nuzzling into his neck. Please wake up soon. When Kaneko arrived at the main room in the center of the apartment, she found that the church representatives and Sona were all in various stages of irritation. To her, the source of their annoyance was clear. Akeno, still clad only in her thong and appropriated shirt, was in the kitchen adjoining and clearly visible through the opening connecting the two rooms. Irina seemed appalled at the queen's behavior, though Zenobia appeared somewhat intrigued for some reason. Kaneko suspected that nudity wasn't really the concern, especially from another female, but it was the blatant sensuality Akeno exuded that seemed to be the issue. For her part, Griselda seemed capable of ignoring the state of their host and clutched her tea with a white-knuckled grip. Now, Kaneko didn't know the church trio very well, but she at least understood their frustrations. Yet even that paled in comparison to Sona's. Granted, Sona was rather unfazed about the female form, courtesy of knowing Rias for so long. In fact, several times in the past Sona had invited her peerage and Rias to her personal bath, self-contained in a pocket dimension created by her family. No, Sona's irritation wasn't directed at Akeno, even if she was the source of the issue. The issue was the unrepentant pervert in her peerage. It's not fair. Saji was shouting to Sona and just about anyone else who would listen. Haidu not only gets the naked healing treatment, but he also gets it from the biggest breasts known to man. As a man I have a right to be jealous. There was a pulsing tick mark on Sona's brow, especially so after the breast comment, she managed to keep her composure together. Saji, however Rias runs her household is up to her, and if she allows Akeno to share in the process, then so be it. However, and her glasses flashed hauntingly, what they do is their business and none of yours. And this treatment you want so much isn't the only way to heal other devils, simply the most preferred among females. I'll be sure to brush up on alternative methods in the eventuality that you'll be injured. Eventuality? You're openly ogling Akeno. Well, how she dresses in the comfort of her home is her decision, but how you're acting and how Haidu will undoubtedly react bodes ill for you. Saji somehow got the message to shut up and avert his gaze elsewhere, though there were tears aplenty in during and after the process. Kaneko herself was amazed at how Momo and Raruko moved to comfort him, each sitting beside him and holding his arms. So even part of a dragon is enough to attract girls. Kaneko sniffed in disdain, unconsciously channeling Ravel for a moment. Issei is better. Her face heated up at the thought of the demi-drake and the next big step she may have to take to heal him. Bachijutsu, or the bedroom technique, was something she wasn't sure she was prepared for. She knew that she wouldn't mind doing it with Issei, but she wasn't ready at all. If she was Asia's size then maybe, but right now the physical disparity between them was an obstacle. With Issei being as big as he was, it would undoubtedly be very awkward. And considering that Akeno and Rias hadn't even taken that step, or at least she was sure they hadn't yet, she was skeptical as to her odds of survival. Trying to clear her head a little, Kaneko ignored the kitchen for now. Akeno and Asia were still there, making dinner. Try as she might, she couldn't suppress a shudder in delight at the thought of their cooking. Asia had certainly made strides in the most noble art, nearly rivaling Akeno and Rias in her own right. The third years were still ahead due to experience, though Kaneko suspected Akeno employed the service of her duplicating familiar to gain a subtle advantage over Rias via mass quantity. After all, feeding a dragon for any length of time might as well be a full-time job. Approaching the window Issei so usually threw himself out of, Kaneko was surprised to see it ajar. Curious, she pushed it open and clambered onto the ledge. Remembering that cats always land on their feet, she fearlessly climbed until she was on the roof, where she found Kiba lying down, watching the stars. She wordlessly moved next to him, trusting he would talk when ready. It didn't take long. You're disappointed in me. A little. Kiba sighed and closed his eyes. You must think me a monster for not caring. You do care. You cared for your old friends. You care for all of us now. And Issei nearly died because of my actions. Were your actions wrong? When Kiba didn't answer, torn between the polarity of the loaded question, Kaneko answered for him. Issei thought you were right to fight for your friend's memory. But I think you know you were wrong in how you fought. Kiba nearly broke the in there. Quietly sobbing, he sat up with his face in his hands, Kaneko patting him on the back gently. And so. They remained like that for some time. 3 days. That's how long the joint search had taken, yet they were still no closer to finding even a hint of Excalibur or its current possessors. Kuo wasn't nearly large enough to take long to properly search, so by now Rias, Sona, and Griselda agreed that the rogues were concealing themselves with magic. This made things much more difficult, both in the active search and in the passive downtime. After failing once again to locate the holy swords, the Grimoire Peerage and the exorcists had returned to the apartment, with Sona taking her servants to her home as well. With Kiba off brooding, the woman had decided to retire to the baths. Trained against personal comfort as they were, Irina and Zenobia couldn't suppress identical moans of relief when they sank into the warm water. Griselda may have scolded them if she too wasn't enjoying herself at the moment. The door opened, and the three women turned to see Rias, Akeno, Asia, and Kaneko enter. The four were just as tired as they were, and appeared just as happy at the thought of a warm soak. Ravel was missing, only due to the fact that she was technically not allowed to interfere in interfaction affairs as part of her stay. Additionally, she had been tending to Issei, allowing his reluctant mates to leave the premises, and was currently by his side. The female devils let their towels drop away, and as a group stepped to the bathing stools adjacent to the spring. A similar sigh of joy escaped Rias and Asia, while Akeno and Kaneko managed to hold in their exultation in the presence of outsiders, maintaining their more professional boundaries. Shortly after, they too sat down in the spring, though Kaneko was taking her time in washing her tail. "Is the water to your liking?" Rias asked as she settled down. "It is, thank you," Griselda calmly responded. "I must admit, this is a pleasure that we do not often indulge in. My thanks again for the kind hospitality." "You and yours are welcome," Rias nodded politely. Over the past few days, it had become increasingly clear that squabbling amongst each other would do more harm than good. The church trio was still wary, treading on eggshells as it were with Albion's threat hanging above them, so Rias had made it clear that her team would be on their best behavior. Sona had made a similar agreement, though she had warned both sides of the apparent perversity of her pawn, as well as a request if his behavior continued to spiral. The soft knock at the door alerted everyone to Ravel's presence. The Phoenix girl had a towel wrapped around herself as well. "Kiba's watching over Issei, he said you were all here." The girl folded her towel away before taking a spot next to Kaneko, her rival and admittedly best friend. "Welcome Ravel," Rias smiled, though there was worry in her voice. "Is there any change?" The bishop shook her head. "He's stirred a few times now, but he's yet to wake." The girl quickly began scrubbing away, hair let down from its usual drills. "Maybe soon, right? We can hope." Akeno whispered, sinking into the spring as she slouched uncharacteristically. Both first years finished up, then jumped in, eager to enjoy in the hot spring as well. Now that they were all closer, Griselda began to ask several questions that she hadn't before. "This Issei. He's your bondmate, is he not?" All heads turned to the eldest woman in shock and suspicion. "In a sense," Rias answered cautiously, "though he has yet to complete the connection with me and Akeno. I did think it odd that both of you were using your unique healing talents without snapping at each other. It was my understanding that dragon mates, particularly the females, are quite possessive. Issei's perhaps the only dragon capable of multi-bonding. A possible byproduct of the extensive trauma he suffered as a child." Akeno kept a calm and polite tone, yet the context was a subtle warning that further inquiry would not be appreciated. The warning Griselda took to heart, considering that she was immersed in warm water traced with bath salts with the priestess of thunder when she was only human. "He's the one who dealt with the son of the House of Phoenix, is he not?" Zenobia beeped her head to the side. "He must be indeed strong to defeat an immortal adversary." "He is," Ravel snapped. "Issei is the strongest white dragon emperor. Do not make fun of him when your partner cheated." "I did not make jest of it." Zenobia threw her hands up to ward off the accusation, the motion sending her bust jiggling and unknowingly causing the young Phoenix additional frustration. "Nor do I condone Irina's choice, especially with how Ascalon chose her." Ravel stopped glaring, and she joined her fellow devils in looking at Irina curiously. Irina herself had seemingly folded in upon herself, still wary and frightened about her upcoming sentence. Though that didn't stop the devil's innate curiosity. "Chosen? How so?" "Like a sacred gear?" Sensing that Irina was feeling overwhelmed, Griselda decided to save her subordinate while simultaneously preventing Zenobia from releasing details of her possession of Durandal. Natural-born holy swordsmen are a rarity, usually only discovered when granted the opportunity to touch, then train, with one of several holy swords in our possession, the Excalibur fragments among them. However, every generation or so, a sword may disappear temporarily from heaven or a church's vault, only to be rediscovered in the hands of a child seemingly born to best wield its power. It is not quite the same as the sacred gear system, as the system isn't strictly managed by heaven, and the wielder must both be completely human and believe in the Lord as well. The exorcist's glaze turned to the solemn Irina. When Irina was discovered to be the current wielder of Ascalon, her father packed up and left Kuo, knowing that this town rests upon what has traditionally been a domain of dragons near since the beginning of time. I was 9. Irina spoke up. One night I fell asleep, the next morning I woke to find the sword floating before my bed, shrouded in golden light. She shuffled in place. Papa took me and Mama away to Italy the next day. I didn't understand, Papa only said I was special and needed to be protected while I learned to use the Lord's gift. There was silence as everyone present tacitly reflected on her words. In a way, it made sense in an objective manner. The elder Shidu had been protecting his daughter in the event another dragon settled back in Kuo. Raising his daughter away from it all, constantly repeating she was special, and even though the upheaval of her life was sudden, it was all for a reason. Small wonder she overzealously summoned her blade to fulfill whatever purpose she had accepted as her own. Though they could understand why Irina had been compelled to use Ascalon, it still didn't justify its use to anyone else. Zenobia frowned to herself. An orphan adopted into the church, her receiving Durandal had happened much the same way, though without the hassle of immediate immigration. All that had changed was she spent her time training when her academic studies were over, training spent under her eventual foster guardian, Griselda. She absently wondered what she would have done in a position similar to Irina. Durandal was a holy sword, yes, but its use was more generalized, its function to peerlessly cut applicable in many areas. Griselda hadn't trained her to fight any one specific enemy, only to be best prepared for numerous situations. To receive a sword whose only purpose was to slay the greatest of fantastical beasts, if she had been in Irina's place, trained by an order of Dragonslayers, she wasn't certain she would make any different a decision. As if to interrupt her thoughts, a red Gremory circle appeared next to the heiress. Zenobia tilted her head once more, uncertain of its purpose. She was a swordswoman, not a spellweaver, and knew only the basics of angelic magic, let alone demonic. The circle was a communication spell, modified for audio only. One of Kiba's. Rias, Akeno, you and the others may want to get over here. Issei's waking up. The message delivered, the circle faded out of existence. For a moment, everyone stared at where the crimson particles disintegrated. Then without preamble, every devil leapt from the pool as if the exorcists were there to exorcise them. Ignoring the towels they had each carried in, the female devils ran for the door, heedless of the water still streaming off their bare skin, steaming in Ravel's case. As the door began to swing shut, Zenobia stood. I suppose we should follow as well. Griselda and Irina stood up as well, preparing to follow, though Irina's face was that of one aware she was walking to the gallows. It was dark. Where was he? For that matter, who was he? Frustration for he did not know, did not understand why he did not know. In that abyss, there was light. Seeing nothing else, he followed it. Odd, it wasn't getting closer. Nor did it seem like he had a tangible body of his own to chase it with. The light brightened. Progress. The light was within his ethereal grasp. Just as he reached further, it expanded and the world hazily lit up in its wake. Said world darkened and flickered. Something felt heavy. Eyelids, that's what they were called. He was struggling to stay awake. But how did he know that? As he fought with the titanic weight, he took in the surroundings. A room, tastefully designed though simplistic by nature. Something soft, he lay upon. A nest. No, a bed, that's the proper word. It was cool and soft, that was all he knew. Yet what were those? He found he could move his neck a little, and observed more. There was a perch beside the nest, and there was a person in that perch. On that perch. In that chair. Observations and the proper words to describe them danced in a chaotic blend as he assigned value to what he now knew. He knew this person. Yudo Kiba. He growled in frustration. Not because of the boy, he knew Kiba was a friend, a good friend, though what a friend was and it meant for Kiba still eluded him. His growl was one of frustration, for while he was learning more about the world around him, he still knew very little about himself. The Kiba person had noticed he was awake and looked startled. He looked at him, then raised a hand with a glowing red disc hovering maybe an inch above it. Kiba friend held it to his ear and began speaking into it. Even if he didn't quite understand the words or intent, 3 words held meaning. Rias, Akeno, Issei. Rias, he thought. Red hair, beautiful woman, gentle soul. She saved him. How? Who was him? He didn't know yet, but he felt that she was important, more so than what he felt for Kiba friend. Yes, Ria's person was important, more important somehow. Akeno. Long midnight hair, kind heart, old friend. So she was a friend before he knew the Kiba person, though she meant as much to him as the Rias person. But what did they both mean? Issei. Who was he? Was he, himself, Issei? Glad to see you're awake and alive, kid. Who? Him. You're having trouble remembering. Severe aura depletion, particularly component memories. Don't worry, it'll pass. Aura? What was that? Maybe this will help. How? He was getting frustrated that he had far too many questions to keep track of. As if to alleviate his discomfort, a burning pain rushed through his mind as memories flooded back to him. Father, mother, childhood, dragon. Akeno, brachial, shuri, friends. Anger, fear, Tartarus, Kuroka, escape, death, rias and Akeno. The influx of memories continued until Issei, for that's who he now remembered himself to be, recalled every detail of his life perfectly. His skills, his strength, his companions and his mates, rias and Akeno. And as if to speak of the devils, they appeared. The door across the bed swung open, nearly falling off its hinges. Rias and Akeno were there, followed closely by Kaneko, Asia and Ravel. The older beauties smiled with tearful expressions as they rushed to his sides. Still unable to move much, Issei could only smile weakly back as his limbs and voice betrayed him. Rias and Akeno were the first to reach him, throwing themselves at him by leaping over the foot off the bed. He grunted weakly as they landed in his arms, the impact from the two driving whatever breath he had from his lungs. As if to compound the issue, gentle but determined hands lifted his head from the pillow to deliver him unto their ministrations. Issei, Rias and Akeno met in a three-way kiss in the center. It was a messy affair, more passion and enthusiasm than anything else, though none of them would trade it for anything else. Emotions flooded through the bond, alerting him to the fear and terror both girls had felt over the past 3 days. He strained to return those feelings, to mentally calm and soothe them that he was in fact alive and recovering. He wasn't sure if they felt his intentions, but that was assuaged when both girls renewed their physical ardor. Soon enough, his lungs burned for air and he broke away weakly. "Heh," he gasped, "I missed you too." Further communication was cut off as Rias bodily pulled him up into a sitting position. Taking her usual place, she straddled one of his legs and sat back, pulling him into the valley between her breasts as she hugged him close. "Never, never, never do that again," she cried, tears falling from her cheeks to land on his brow. Before he could formulate a response or escape plan, he was liberated from Rias when Akeno forcibly pulled him into her bosom as well, mirroring their king in her position. "You scared me to death, you can't leave me again." Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately depending on personal preference, they took notice of his frantic thrashing, and Akeno released him, only to hug him to her as he gasped for breath. I don't plan to try that again," he panted slowly, savoring fresh air and the softness of his current pillow. Both girls smiled gently at him before allowing him to recline once more and take their usual places, hugging his sides. He ignored that they were still wet from the bath, they would warm eventually at his side. Even if the flame in his gut was burning at an all-time low, he could warm them at the very least. He didn't deny that they were still soaked was a turn-on. Watching the beads of moisture drip off them or run down their forms was exciting to no end. However, even though the spirit was willing, the flesh was weak. So he suppressed his primal carnal urges in favor of observing everyone else who had come to his bedside. For a moment, he panicked, believing his current state to be that of complete nudity in front of the others, then relaxed as he realized he was wearing sweatpants. Thibaut was still off to the side, trying and failing to hide looks of regret, shame, and somehow, amusement. The hell was the pretty boy smiling at? Issei scowled until he found a tiny weight dropped onto his legs, make that tiny weight and slighter pressures as 2 others dropped onto the bed. Looking to the weight's location, he found that it was Kaneko sitting on his legs, looking at him with hope and curiosity in her cat-like eyes. Her ears weren't level, one almost laid flat completely, while the other was raised a little higher, lending her a rather depressed look. Her tail twitched idly behind her, though not as lively as he had seen sometimes. On either side of the Nekomata, and between her and the older girls, were Asia and Ravel. Both bishops had their hair down, still damp with moisture, so it clung to their skin. Both were gazing at him with concern and longing that made him slightly uncomfortable for one common reason they currently shared with Kaneko. All 3 girls were completely naked, and it appeared that in their concern, they were completely unaware of the fact. If that wasn't distracting enough for him, the fact that they must have all been bathing together and were still wet was making things much harder for him. In an effort to preserve whatever modesty they had left, Issei screwed his eyes shut. "It's nice to see you girls too, but..." "Issei." Asia part wept, part cried, part shouted as she clung to him. "I was so worried." "Asia, it's okay, I'm fine. Senpai is stupid. Making us worry." Kaneko leaned forward to wrap her arms around his waist, nuzzling her face against the bandages wrapped around his midsection. "Promise not to anymore." "Promise what?" "Issei." Ravel's voice ground out between clenched teeth. "After all we went through in order to heal you, why can't you look at us and say thank you very much?" Ravel. Rias said with a touch of amusement. "Look at yourself before making that request." Ravel looked down at her developing figure and stared for a moment as she tried to understand what her senior meant. After a few seconds, she shrieked as she wrapped her arms around herself. "Don't look at me, perv." "Look at us, don't look at me, what's her damage?" Issei whined internally. If I have to spell it out for you, then perhaps repairing your memory and knowledge was a fruitless endeavor. Just how did you do that anyway? The Vine Dividing contains the experiences of all my past wielders, as well as a passable imprint off their souls. It's how you trained with memories not your own. Did you think yourself exempt from such effect? Issei only shook his head, simultaneously responding in his own way to both circumstances. Ravel, in fact, all three of you, would you mind putting on some clothes? The three girls looked at each other quizzically. Unseen to the demi-drake, there was a rather heated but silent exchange held as each of the three argued what to do, as well as fight against the unspoken demands the older girls gave of what they thought they should do. Instead of acquiescing to what should have been a reasonable request, the girls only held on to him even tighter, though of the three, Ravel draped herself in the cast-aside upper sheet of the bed, hiding herself from him, though her body was still perfectly outlined. Asia simply put her head down on his leg and sighed in contentment, obviously not going anywhere. Kaneko tightened her grip around him, then nearly leapt to the other side of the room when he winced in pain. Issei immediately regretted the hiss of pain that escaped him as he felt and sensed Kaneko practically teleport away from him. Opening his eyes, he steeled himself to look beyond the state of undress the girls were in to try and placate the apologetic Nekashu. Kaneko looked so adorably pitiful in that moment, both ears flattened and tail completely limp. "Kaneko, come on, there's no need for that," he near whispered, knowing that her hearing was acute enough to understand. "Seriously, I know you didn't mean to hurt me, so come here." She hesitated for a moment before blurring back atop him, though she took care to rest her head on his left side, opposite from the aching cut. Speaking of which, Issei looked at the white strips of fabric bound around his abdomen. He didn't smell any blood, possibly a good sign. Instead, he smelled a combination of several herbs and salves which he assumed were intended to promote healing. He doubted their effectiveness, but even if it was a placebo for the others, then it was good enough for him. "Help me sit up," he requested to his future mates, who promptly sat up in order to support him. "I assume healing me was a team effort." When the girls nodded in unison, Issei smiled. Slowly and non-threateningly, he unfurled his wings to curve around them all, so that the 5 females were held close to him beneath a white curtain. "Thanks you guys. I mean it." The ensuing heat from 5 identical blushes outstripped his current ability to act as a heat source. Issei detachedly wondered if this was what everyone felt in proximity to his element. Still though, it was comforting, and he relaxed inside the alcove in the company of friends. Unfortunately, the ideal tranquility came to an end. While Issei could hear Kiba's breathing and heartbeat outside the tent, there was also a series of noises approaching from outside the room. He sighed, relaxed his posture as his wings opened up so that the group could see the door, still ajar from the girl's frantic entrance. "Zenobia," an emotionally distraught voice sounded out, "is that really necessary? I do not understand your concern. Is it not the custom of our hosts to walk amongst their home naked?" "Zenobia, while there does not seem to be any blatant sexual intent, it is hardly acceptable behavior as we are still guests." Griselda seemed both annoyed and resigned to her ward's decision. "The Phoenix girl is a guest as well, and she saw nothing wrong with it," Zenobia firmly replied, her tone implying that she had made a decision. "The lecherous one is not here, and because the dragon is still in recovery, what implicit acts can occur when the only male is incapacitated?" Irina appeared in the doorway, walking backwards as she ranted to her partner. "But the demidrake isn't the only male here. There's the project survivor too." She pointed at Kiba now that she was in the room. Griselda walked in after her, a hand on her head as she tried to stave off a headache. "Additionally, implicit acts among devils are not strictly between man and woman, Zenobia. The devil community is imbalanced in orientation, as many females turn to each other for comfort and pleasure, especially if they are in a harem and the sole male is otherwise engaged." The fact that Griselda knew about this caused a number of reactions. Surprise, in the devil's case. It was completely true, in the bid for repopulation, harems had become more and more popular, sometimes encouraged for exceptionally strong or gifted individuals, in the hopes that their strength could be passed to the next generation. Faithfulness, marriage, sexuality, these all became somewhat skewed in the desperate population bid, adjustments that remained even when the evil pieces had been created. The fact that most male devils were secretly turned on by girl-on-girl action certainly helped. Of course, the harems weren't always one male and multiple female partners. Just because they weren't as well known or popular didn't mean that a high-class female didn't have a few males on call. Again, a species driven by desires, making the best off their underpopulated circumstances of course. Either way, the devils were surprised that a woman off the church would so blatantly acknowledge things like that. Kiba looked floored, while Ravel and Asia were quite embarrassed. Kaneko kept her visage hidden in Issei's side, but he suspected she was blushing furiously. Akeno and Rias said nothing, their unique relationship with Issei speaking for itself. Irina was reaching a color most similar to Ria's hair as she kept muttering to herself, obviously trying to comprehend exactly what her elder meant. Now Zenobia entered, fully naked as her comrades had quite explicitly stated. Unashamed of her nudity, she stood with her hands at her sides, simply uncaring of her condition. Now, while Issei was in a relationship with Rias and Akeno simultaneously, that didn't mean he was blind. Certainly, all the girls he was currently buried under had their charm, both physical or emotional. Rias and Akeno both had fully seductive figures, and their personalities complemented as their souls connected slowly. Ravel and Asia were not nearly as well endowed, but instead carried a modest figure that seemed balanced between girlhood and womanhood. Both girls had their traits as well, he wasn't as uncouth to only see them for their bodies after all. And Kaneko was the definition of Mo. Their first interactions aside, any time she had appeared upset made him feel like he had somehow kicked a kitten and hurried to make her feel better. Relationship or not, attraction or not, Zenobia was just different. While all the devils had their physical traits as growing women, Zenobia wasn't seductive in the same way the older girls were. Just by observing her present state, Issei could see that she was well muscled in places that none of the others were. Abs subtly showing on her stomach, arms showing a bit more definition than the others, she wasn't a beauty in the overtly sexual way Akeno and Rias were sometimes portrayed, more like the Amazon warrior princess way. It was strange, she was beautiful in her own right and could easily be a model just like the many devils present. Yet somehow, Issei knew that any career available as a model would be set aside. The girl had the figure of an Olympic gymnast, and if her fight the other day, what he had observed at least, said anything, she'd rather be a warrior than a woman. He wasn't the only one to notice her beauty, rather, others noticed his reaction to her beauty. Akeno and Rias both frowned and pinched his cheeks, sending all thoughts of Amazons and swordswomen astray. They weren't the only ones, Ravel glared at him, and he felt the effects as the temperature rose from her emotionally charged intent. Asia looked as if she was going to cry, making him feel worthless again. Kaneko bit him, or at least tried to, her tiny fangs leaving scratch marks on his otherwise invulnerable skin. Miss Zenobia, Rias ground out, well they say imitation is the highest form of flattery, I must ask that you clothe yourself. Zenobia currently had her head beeped to the side as she considered the implications for her elder's revelation about devils and sexuality. At Ria's prompting, she nodded and stepped out to change, causing the girls still present to sigh in relief. One less distraction for Issei's affection gone, for now at least. When her ward had departed, Griselda stepped forward to the bedside, though she kept a comfortable distance from Akeno and Ravel. It is good to see you're awake, White Dragon Emperor, she respectfully greeted him. How are you feeling? Hungry? The exorcist nearly face-faulted at the simple summation of his condition. I'm sorry. I said hungry, and what's to apologize for? I have no quarrel with you. The woman sighed, before looking at him. While you were unconscious, Lord Albion made several demands, lest he order the complete and total annihilation of Christianity. Issei's eyes nearly bugged out of his skull. He did what? She nodded solemnly. He was understandably upset, given your condition. While many of his demands are out of our hands, he did argue that Irina's punishment was to be left in yours. Say what now? A recompense for the injury she inflicted on you. What happens to her now is your decision, and while it is not my place nor my right to ask anything of you, I would plead leniency on her behalf. Having said all she needed to, Griselda stepped away, stopping next to Irina, where she whispered a few words into her ear. Irina didn't look any better, but she stood up straighter. Well, head held high was a better way to endear herself. Apparently satisfied, Griselda moved aside to let Irina walk hesitantly to the bedside. Issei may not be the brightest, but even he could feel the well-hidden animosity from four of the girls atop him. Rias and Akeno couldn't exactly hide their dislike of her from him, the growing bond prevented that. Ravel turned her glare from him to Irina, and Kaneko's posture now closely mimicked a cat raising its hackles. The smooth fur of her ears and tails fluffed up a bit, and she may have even paced the room if not for that she was reluctant to let go of him. Asia didn't display any sort of malice for the exorcist, as her typical behavior prevented any animosity from ever crossing her mind. However, she was worried, but worried for him. Damn, what do I do? Kill her, torture her, possibilities are endless. You're not helping. Issei Haidu, White Dragon Emperor. Irina began, I apologize for my grievous actions against you, and she gulped, and I submit to any punishment you deem fit. Do acknowledge your apology and submission. Issei slowly began, pausing as he thought of an appropriate response. In regards to your punishment however, I'm going to have to delay it for a bit. Irina's complexion returned to normal at his words as she looked less like a ghost. You what? The shock and surprise was echoed all around as everyone turned to look at the demidrake, who let go of his mate's waists as he held his hands up to ward off questions. It's not a matter of me wanting to punish you or not, understand that. Problem is, in my condition I can't. As if to demonstrate, Issei manifested as much power as he could to unleash the predatory gaze dragons were revered for. Irina quailed under the colossal pressure, but everyone who had felt it before noted that it was hardly the same pressure that compelled Yubaluna to practically give up. Make no mistake, it was terrifying enough, but the pressure lifted as Issei began to cough uncontrollably, his lungs straining in exertion as he gulped and choked on air. You see? He gasped for breath, I can't move on my own right now, nor can I really do anything to you from here. As far as any obligation exists between us, I really can't do anything about it right now, understand? Irina nodded and bowed slightly. Then I shall wait for a time where you are better capable. Without preamble, she turned and walked away, past Zenobia who had just arrived and into the hall. While no one besides the blue-haired girl saw her, Issei could hear the poor girl collapse in the hallway, leaning on the walls for support as she made her way to her room to recover from her temporary ordeal. Zenobia appeared to have just arrived in time to be on the receiving end of the terrifying presence for the short time Issei could maintain it. While not the intended recipient, she had still gotten a good amount of exposure, though she wasn't petrified like others had been before. She was clothed now, thankfully, but was now staring at Issei with the same scrutiny as he had given her before. Before she could speak, Griselda took her arm and escorted her out, shutting the door between them, giving the devil some privacy. Issei took pleasure in that Griselda was several shades paler than before, proving that if she was affected that severely, he wasn't completely helpless now. Silence reigned for a moment until Kiba cleared his throat. Look, Issei. Kiba, there's. Both boys looked at each other in surprise at how they had cut each other off before Issei shrugged. You first. Kiba nodded and continued, Issei, about the duel, it wasn't my intention to drag you into my problems. I am sorry, and I'll make it up to you in whatever way I can. The demi-drake stared at him for a time, unnerving the blonde knight. Unknown to anyone, Issei was employing the use of perfectly translucent scales over his eyes. A sign of his continued physical maturation, this second set of eyelids allowed him to avoid getting dust or contaminants in his eyes in flight, while also granting him the ability to hold a dead stare for incredible lengths. It was a skill that had served him well in staring competitions with Kaneko for the last serving of whatever dish the proclaimed three kitchen goddesses could concoct. Once Kiba had sweated long enough, Issei blinked, sliding the extra lids away. Kiba, you are an idiot. Whatever the knight had been expecting, it wasn't that. What? Look man, Issei groaned, were you the one to wield Ascalon? When Kiba opened his mouth, Issei interrupted. Didn't think so. And did you have any idea how far the zealots planned to take the duel if necessary? The knight sighed, exasperated, of course not. Then I have no idea what you're being sorry for. And remember, I had a stake in this as well, or did you forget that it was Kakabiel that locked me away? It was a chilling reminder, in the chaos after the duel, no one had stopped to think of the connection to the current affair that existed between Issei and the theft's perpetrator. Now that they were considering it, everyone aware of Kakabiel's involvement with Tartarus and Issei's death highly doubted that Issei would remain neutral in the conflict over the Excalibur fragments. Kiba looked hesitant but then bowed his head, smiling weakly. I guess this is one of those rare times where you are capable of undoing any arguments of mine. Then I'll say this. Thank you for trying to help. Any time, was the quick response, followed shortly by, wait a sec, rare times. I'll talk to you later, Issei. Someone's got to keep an eye on the church delegation after all. Kiba slipped out the door before an unsealed piece of scrap metal embedded itself in the frame. Damn pretty boy, the demi-drake growled. Who does he think he is? Issei's ruminations were brought to a crashing halt as he realized there were still 5 females with him. Rias and Akeno were both panting slightly, cheeks reddened, and since their nudity prevented them from hiding it, their nipples had hardened in their current arousal. Remembering the side effects of his mate's exposure to draconic presence, Issei was surprised to see that Asia, Ravel, and Kaneko, while still pale and shaken, were nowhere near as bad as they had been when he had unleashed that trait on unsuspecting stray devils on their scattered hunts. Curious. Also quite dangerous. Issei was well aware what the half-lit gazes he was receiving meant. He was also painfully aware that both girls had been highly stressed while he was unconscious and that neither had had any form of release in that time. If you weren't injured, Akeno purred in his ear, then be assured, I'd totally be riding you, making you beg for mercy. Dead in line, Sister Queen, Rias firmly objected, hugging Issei and stroking his chest with a finger. You'll have to take second in this particular race. While the younger girls all reddened at such casual suggestion that Issei could be raped in the near future, the demi-drake in question simply laid his head back and tried to go back to sleep. Really, this behavior was becoming quite normal. And here you go. Akeno set a plate before the dragon, piled high with breakfast. Eat up. With pleasure. Issei quickly tore into the first meal he had had in days, sustenance in the form of transferred demonic energy didn't count. Within moments, the collection of steamed rice, miso soup, grilled fish, tamagoyaki, and natto vanished. Almost immediately, Rias replaced the plate with one of her own, consisting of a European continental breakfast, and just as fast, the hungry dragon practically inhaled the meal. Asia too tried her hand, her effort at an omelette devoured in one bite. The stiff competition for undisputed ruler of the kitchen was still underway, not that Issei was one to complain. But now, a new challenger appeared. Issei, I made pancakes this morning. Would you like to try some? Ravel nervously stood in the entranceway to the dining room, delicately poking her pointer fingers together in her nervousness. The demi-drake suppressed a belch and nodded. Yes, please. The Phoenix girl brightened considerably as she ran back into the kitchen before returning with a considerable stack of cakes, with a pitcher of syrup to go with it. By now, Akeno's familiars had finished up mass production and the rest of the food floated in. Her Oni could only be seen by whom they wanted to be visible, so to the exorcists at the table, it appeared that the trays of heaping food were floating an inch above the ground before levitating to table height. Why does he get to eat first? An impatient Zenobia asked. It was a fair question, besides the monster in Issei's stomach, the only other person hungrier than the girl was the smallest one there, Kaneko. Said Nekomata scowled at the other girl before deadpanning to her. Issei hasn't eaten in days. Let him catch up. Perhaps it was Kaneko's inability to cook that made her bitter at the moment. Her cooking was decent enough, but in comparison to the kitchen goddesses, there was no chance. And now Ravel, her unofficial rival, was now apparently making strides in the most noble art of breaking fast. As if to placate her, Ravel laid a similar plate of pancakes in front of the Nekomata. Instantly, her ears sprang back up and she quickly thanked her friend before tearing into the pile with her customary speed. Once all the food had been carried over, Rias, Akeno, and Asia sat down with everyone else and joined in on the meal. As expected, the exorcist said grace, blessing the food and their hosts, which was poorly received once every devil present had a splitting headache. Griselda and Irina at least had the decency to look apologetic, while Zenobia practically dove into her portion. So, Issei, do you think you'll be able to assist in the Excalibur hunt anytime soon? Asked Rias. She didn't expect a positive answer, but given her attempts to read his emotional state through the bond, she hoped he'd at least be honest to her and himself. Not anytime soon, I think, Issei frowned. Moving around is hard enough, I'm honestly tempted to just use my wings to get everywhere. Not a chance, Akeno warned. If you fly everywhere, then your muscles will only atrophy. After all, we wouldn't want that. No one except maybe Irina and Zenobia missed out on what exactly why Akeno wanted Issei in the best condition. The devils forgave her of course, they knew that Akeno had formed a near dependency on Issei, more so than Rias and Asia. No one could fault her, she had already lost him once before to Tartarus, and recent events had shaken her. As it was, her desire to finally complete the bond was well founded. Of course, Albion had shot that down once Akeno had asked that morning. While Akeno and Rias had made every emotional argument as to why they should be allowed to cement the connection as soon as possible, Albion had rebuffed them on Issei's behalf, citing that the strength needed to permanently bind their souls together would require Issei in near perfect health, and that would take time. That or repeatedly divide power from someone stronger than him to replenish the needed energy. You're alright, aren't you? Asia asked him worriedly, green eyes full of concern. Finding it hard to answer negative, Issei debated to leave his response as ambiguous as possible, though he rephrased his answer considering the headache from the prayer. I'm getting there, possibly even better than 100%. After all, from life's school of war. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Issei speared a piece of bacon with a fork and brought it to his maw when Griselda's cold voice interrupted. An interesting choice of words, to say the least. The woman's voice was below freezing. Quoted verbatim from Twilight of the Idols by Friedrich Nietzsche. A quote, though perverted by modern culture, that was first penned in a book written by a man to introduce his beliefs, one of which that the church was little more than a method to enslave the unwitting masses. Furthermore, each underlying point factored into his claim that God is dead. Immediately, Irina and Zenobia glared at Issei for blasphemy, even if indirect or made in jest. Asia teared up slightly, making Issei feel some regret for his choice of phrase, though he wasn't going to take his words back. It certainly wasn't his fault if the woman read too far into it to find the veiled insult. I'm surprised that you recognize it, I myself did not know the origin until I read it for an assignment. While the church does not sanction such text, many of my own peers keep up to date on the nonsense published against our religion, Griselda spoke softly. I would ask that you refrain from mentioning any more of that man's work, his or Darwin's, while we are here. Issei shrugged, the words had done what he wanted, put the trio on edge slightly. He had gone for some time without a verbal sparring match after all, and admittedly childish as it was much more fun to poke fun at people who would take offense. Besides, the only sign evolution had ever occurred at any time in history was when the first few generations of dragons, including the legendaries, were born from raw primordial energy, and that was a strictly one-time thing. Rias and Akeno looked at him in surprise. He raised an eyebrow and shrugged. I pay attention in class sometimes, what's so surprising? When both girls looked at each other in embarrassment, Issei vowed to at the very least put more visible effort into his academic study for now. This preconception that he was only an average student was beginning to annoy. Hiding his exasperation, he turned to Griselda. My apologies, I shall refrain from referencing any such literary work in our time together. Griselda didn't say anything, only nodding and accepting his apology in a tacit manner. Returning her attention to the food before her, she began to eat in earnest. The meal continued quietly, most everyone lost in thought for one reason or another. Once everyone had had his or her fill, they all pitched in to clean up quickly before the day's continued search for the stolen swords. Once finished, Issei and Ravel sat apart from the others as they would not be joining the expedition. The demi-drake fumed in silence, he was not accustomed to being useless. He held his tongue though. Rias and Akeno had made it clear that they wanted nothing more than to stay in the apartment with him in comfort, but their presence was necessary as they, Sona and her queen, were the strongest devils present with him on the sidelines. It wasn't ideal, it certainly annoyed him, but he knew that it would be most unfair to ask them to decide between their feelings and their duty in this time. Therefore he stayed quiet, even as he felt sorrow and regret bleed over the mental connections. Both Akeno and Rias were far too emotional right now to even consider training to hide their emotional state from him. Though he supposed that was only fair. He knew that he would never have a moment's peace if either one was hurt in some way. In a few short minutes, the assembled team was ready to teleport out again. Choosing to wear the school uniforms, ones altered with magic to be more combat durable, Rias, Akeno, Asia, Kiba and Kaneko all stood patiently as the exorcists arrived from their rooms. Zenobia and Irina appeared first, with Destruction and Ascalon clearly visible held in place on their backs. While no one was happy with Irina, that hadn't stopped Rias from requesting that she not conceal, out of sight out of mind mentality applying here, or something like that. Griselda followed after, her outfit being a rather form-fitting nun outfit. Though it was sacrilegious, Issei couldn't help but wonder if the rumors of old men in the Vatican being secret perverts held any merit. If they were the ones that designed the female combat outfit, then rumors confirmed. A knock at the door showed Sona and her entourage arrive, combat-ready in magically altered uniforms of their own. Issei wasn't particularly happy to see Saji again, though since Kiba was there to chaperone he supposed there was little the pervert could do. Every girl besides the two in the Citri peerage that seemed to like him had moved a healthy distance away, though if Saji used his sacred gear in the same manner to extend his reach, then they wouldn't be far enough. Alright, we're all here, Sona announced after a quick head count. She held up a hand to create a transport seal, her control more fine-tuned than Ria's, so as to transport without the human suffering from magical exhaustion. Time to go. Rias and Akeno broke away from the group to give Issei quick kisses before departure. Asia took a running start to throw her arms around his neck to squeeze him in a hug. Kaneko settled for wrapping her arms around his waist. Their goodbyes said, the search team departed, leaving a dragon and a phoenix alone together. Well, what now? Issei asked the first year, who looked flustered at the question. How should I know? Ravel chirped irritably. Well, you've had free run of the place for the last few days I hear, is there anything you want to do? Want to do? I've spent most my time trying to replenish my supply of phoenix tears, I used up my inventory healing you. Ravel raised her voice as she looked away haughtily. Believe me there are many other things I'd rather want to do. Ravel, Issei whispered softly, thank you. The effect was immediate, Ravel blushed and her drill-like hair began to shimmer as she lost self-control, even if momentarily. But of course. You're my host and teacher after all, that's why I did it. She turned slightly, though he could still hear the next words, you can't just read into it like that. Like what? Now he was confused. Ravel's hair burst into flame as she stammered, nothing. I'll grand see if I can find a board game or book or something, and with that she fled. The injured demi-drake sat there for a minute as he stared after her. I will never understand girls. Amen to that. Issei focused inward, determined to get some answers to a question that had been nagging at him for some time. Albion, what were you thinking? Come again. When you first threatened the church with annihilation. You were ready to instigate all-out war, just for me. You're my host. Do I need another reason? Issei shook his head, though he kept silent and continued to speak mentally, so that Ravel could not hear. I'm not the first of your wielders to get screwed over by the church or another cult or faction. And while Dragonkind still has the strength and numbers to fulfill an operation like that, it would only cause more trouble in the long run, we'd be ruining our ability to negotiate peacefully with any faction thereafter. So why do it? What makes me so special that you'd sacrifice the peace we've desperately needed? In the back of his mind, he felt a number of emotions roil from the great beast. Issei, the vanishing dragon, spoke softly, even for their usual conversation via thought. I ask that you let me keep my reasons to myself, for now at least. You don't trust me. Far from it. If anything, of all my hosts, you are the one I can trust to act honorably and remain loyal to your own values. But for my reasons, my reticence, you'll know what you need when you need to know it. And just when is that? Or is this another thing that I won't ever be ready for? Issei struggled to keep his annoyance hidden, something he knew Albion would know if regardless of his efforts. I know you are ready. The world may not be. Albion's presence receded into the far reaches of his mind, leaving Issei alone with his thoughts. Issei huffed petulantly and limped into kitchen for a drink. Sipping on cold water, he glanced at the clock in the hallway, noticing that the others had only departed maybe 10 minutes before. He sighed. He was already tired of waiting. Fried Selzen, self-proclaimed best shitty devil slayer, was tired of waiting. For 3 days, now on the 4th, he had been discreetly following the search group hunting him and his compatriots. Of course he made sure to never be spotted. Excalibur transparency not only made him invisible, but removed near all trace of him completely. Sight, sound, smell, the shitty devils and humans below him would never even notice his presence. Of course, that would change if the shitty holy dragon was still around. Fried didn't quite know the extent of transparency's abilities, mostly from Kakabiel's warning that transparency may not be enough to fool the natural predator. Fortunately, it seemed like that particular problem had been dealt with. One of the exorcist sluts had Ascalon of all things on her back and the shitty dragon was missing. Maybe she got lucky, who knows. Deciding that following them for another day, especially when they were nowhere close to finding their lair, yes, he called it a lair to annoy Valper, he jumped down from the roof he was perched on and ran off. An hour later, the stray exorcist sauntered into the temporary if luxuriant safe house, transparency in one hand and a bag of takeout in another. Honey, I'm home. At the head of the dining table, Valper Galilei looked up from his task of preparing Excalibur rapidly for its grand debut. Welcome, Fried. I assume since you're early we are in no danger of yet being found. Ding ding. Give the man a prize. Fried plopped down on a couch where he dug into the still hot noodles. Noisily chewing, he eyed the second sword he had stolen before slurping up his current mouthful. When do I get to try out rapidly? When it is finished, fused with transparency and not a moment before. Valper put his glasses back on, adjusting the doctor's magnifying lenses to better examine the blade. Aw, come on old man. I need to kill someone awesomely, I'm going through withdrawal. Patience, Fried. The exorcist shivered as a new voice, cold yet calm, collected though irritated. A figure was sitting on one of the larger chairs, hidden in shadow as he faced the fireplace. The tall back of the chair prevented Fried from seeing his current boss, though he could see there was an old tome in the other man's lap. Resting against the chair's side was a black sword with a jagged edge that spiraled its length. A blade that would not withstand repeated blows, it was a delicately serrated edge meant to torture and maim a helpless victim. A pale white hand turned the page, 42 lines printed in Latin. Judging by the age off the paper and the degradation time had had on the cover as well as the age of the man, Fried could only assume that it was an original Gutenberg Bible. Tell me, the group that hunts us. The Shidu girl, she has Ascalon correct? Fried felt fear and annoyance in equal measure, so he wisened up to answer carefully. She was there with it and the dragon noticeably absent. The mood of the group was also kindled down too. The long pointer traced a line of characters before stopping. 1 Corinthians, chapter 14, verse 34. Let your women keep silence in the churches. For it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. The dark figure chuckled for a moment. True to form, the church sent its sacrificial zealots first into the fray, where they are unable to speak against or resist orders. I wasn't aware that God approved of overzealousness. Valper commented, still immersed in his work. God never lifted a finger to write his so-called word. It was written by mortal men and contains such noticeable bias. At least it does in original form. I'm sure that modern revisions have done away with many of the obvious lights against chivalry. The hand flipped through the pages as if searching for something specific. That they are working together rather than fight openly is a sign the demidrake yet lives. Fried scoffed openly, the shitty dragon. Why in hell is that important? If he's kicked it, big deal, but if not, then I've got dibs on cutting him. Instantly, several light spears formed to surround Fried. The boy lives, understand the Selzen, should the dragon die now, then our plans die with him. Selzen gulped loudly as the light show faded. The man hadn't even moved or gotten out of his chair. We need him as our catalyst, our harbinger, our shot heard round the world, as it were. I had hoped that time in the pit would break his mind, make him a malleable weapon, grateful to me when I freed him. While detecting holy energy inside him wasn't difficult at all, the presence of a heavenly dragon was indeed a recent surprise, therefore we shall have to try harder to break him. Alper looked up from his work once more. So that is why you stressed stealing that Excalibur first. To move things along, force him to comply. Of course. All things considered, it is perhaps a blessing that Ascalon is present and he absent. If wounded, then the Demidrake's power to resist will be weakened severely. When he escaped Tartarus, I ordered his demise since I had no means to control him then, better for him to be dead than draw suspicion to me. Now, I suppose I should be grateful to the devils for keeping him alive long enough to secure a method of control myself. The hand not searching through the pages reached for the hilt of the dark blade, lifting it to rest across the man's knees. The Kabiel, cadre class fallen angel, former leader of the Grigori, smiled bitterly as he stroked the flat of his third Excalibur fragment and continued to read. But the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition the ungodly. The verse foretelling assured destruction often filled believers with dread, but for him it was a release. He sighed, and knowing that disaster will fall, having seen it time and time again, though this time it would be by his doing. Well played, White Dragon Emperor. Truly, it is unfortunate and unfair for you, but this is quite necessary. God's righteous fire must play its needed part in the coming war. All good things must come to an end eventually, your pleasant dreams are at their end. In his lap, Excalibur Nightmare glinted darkly, as if the sword itself hungered for the excruciating agony promised to come. End of the part 11. So how was this story? I hope you like it. And if you like it, share this story with your friends and like the video too. And don't forget to subscribe our channel for daily awesome fanfiction. Okay, it's time for me to go. Bye bye.